So the first thing I will just ask you quickly to do is to introduce yourself and tell people that will be watching. Many of them will be looking at you in translation in
Hmm.
Spanish speaking channels where my biggest audience is right now. But so if you
Yeah,
can tell a bit about who you are and importantly, and I'm sorry to say, your background as well.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I am Darian Meacham, so I work as a professor of philosophy at the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands. I live in Brussels, the capital of the European Union, capital of Belgium, and a lot of the work that we do has to do with, let's say, the European policy, the European project. So let's say the social and political theory that sits behind the European project. I came to Europe many years ago, 2020, I think was when I first arrived here as a student. I came from the United States, having also studied in Montreal in Canada. And I think, I mean, a little bit importantly for the context that we're going to talk about, of course, so I'm Iranian American. So my mother is from Iran, lives in the US at the moment. I was born and raised in the United States. Um, and sort of grew up in the 80s in the United States. I was born in 1977, so 2 years before the Iran hostage crisis in the United States. So grew up in the 80s and 90s in the U.S. Let's just say it was a strange time to be an Iranian American, probably. So really always, and I think we've been hearing a little bit about that now from various sources, sort of 40 years, 40 some years for 40, almost 48 years old, 48 years old tomorrow, of sort of intense demonization of Iran, and, to some extent also Iranians. Um, the nuance, there's not a great amount of nuance always in the American political discourse or in any political discourse for that matter. So that has certainly colored the way that I see the world, the way that I approach the questions that we're going to talk about, and the way that I approach my thinking. Also, I mean, you talked about being in exile, and I think that is certainly a feeling that I can identify with and I've had for quite some time, but maybe for my whole life, in a sense of always a little bit feeling in exile. And so certainly feeling, out of place in the United States as an Iranian American. Um, Having very sort of left-wing parents also, so I didn't have this great, or I wasn't imbued with this great urge or drive to integrate into, sort of mainstream American culture or mainstream American political culture, certainly at the same time. And then, of course, coming to Europe and living in Europe, working in Europe, raising children in Europe, and feeling always I mean, and with, I'm a naturalized Belgian citizen, feeling like a foreigner here, and just coming to terms a little bit with that feeling of foreignness, and actually thinking, well, that distance that you have can also be an asset, right, and can also gives you a certain perspective and a certain view. Um, I think, you talked to Martin about some despondency that we're both feeling the last, couple of years now, and building since the um, genocide in Gaza has been unfurling, on whatever what word we want to use, happening. I think that sense of despondency has really grown. Um, and I think we do face really a kind of moral collapse, a moral catastrophe. Um, and that's really difficult uh, to be able to get your head around, to think about. Um, and at the same time, I think the kind of distance that I just spoke about, so that sense of being always in exile, does help you a little bit in some point, at some points, um, to be able to.
Because it's not your collapse, so to say, right? I mean, at
Well, it
least you
is and it
can.
is. No, it is and it isn't. So I think it gives you that double perspective, right? So I would
Mm.
not for one moment say that it's not my collapse, right? So I think this is the collapse. This is the collapse of European civil society as a kind of moral project. And I don't mean to implicate by any means, all of European civil society or all of European, political life in that. But I do think we see something that is certainly an extreme crisis here. And I think having that sort of inside and outside view on that can be important. So seeing that from the outside, and trying to communicate also how that looks from the outside, and how that sounds, and how that feels from the outside. while at the same time having some stake on what's happening on the inside. Right, I'm not at all indifferent to what is to European politics. I'm not at all indifferent to European public life, to the European public sphere, nor to the United States for that matter. It remains, where my home, where my family is, etc. At the same time, you have the same feeling about, having a foot in Iran, in my case.
Mm. I mean, what I keep thinking is that we've been talking about the crisis of democracy for a very long time, and we've been talking about the crisis of democracy around policy questions. So
Mhm.
the policy no longer represents the interest of the people. But I have the feeling that we have now kind of the complete breakdown of democracy, in the sense that we don't have just policy that doesn't represent the interests of the people. We have an entire political class that cannot represent the most fundamental moral intuitions of its
Uh,
people.
yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So I think the way you put it is important. I mean, I think we have a crisis of I wouldn't say the political class as a whole. I want to say maybe the governing class. Um, so we have the crisis of the governing class that I think goes beyond a political crisis. It goes beyond a question of whether or not policy represents the opinion of the people. It doesn't. It hasn't for some time. It goes beyond the efficacy of democratic politics in influencing policy. And I think it can really be described in kind of catastrophic moral terms. Right? We face uh, and that's what I mean when I say we can talk about a crisis and really a catastrophe of the governing classes, right? They are unable to respond for whatever reason, and that's what becomes increasingly evident: is this unableness, this unwillingness, this inability to respond to basic, fundamental moral intuitions. And you hear those intuitions being voiced now in more and more places, also from oftentimes a very, let's say, apolitical perspective, right? I'm thinking of the speech by Pep Guardiola, he's the coach of Manchester City Football Club, to the University of Manchester. It wasn't a political speech. He was giving a commencement speech, I think, right? So it's this, champion football coach giving this commencement speech at a university and talking in very basic moral terms about his intuitions as a parent, as a human being, how he feels seeing the destruction, the genocide unfold in Gaza. And I find increasingly that there's just a kind of sense of shock that our political class, let's say parts of the political class, because I really don't want to say all of it, because there are those members of parliament, members of European Parliament, members of national parliament, all the way down, who are really, really working and trying to do something, but they're just screaming, right? And it seems like oftentimes it's just sort of scream into the void.
This is
Um,
actually, if I can interrupt you, this is something that you mentioned before we started the interview. I mean, over the last couple of days, we've been exchanging messages, and I wanted to pick on, which is this sense that there is now sort of not even an attempt at hiding what the facts are. So, I mean, it
no.
has become increasingly. It's not that it has become increasingly obvious. It was obvious from the very beginning because it was stated. Netanyahu saying Amalek and sort of the willingness of essentially full extermination. This was pretty much said out loud. But it's been increasingly, the evidence has become increasingly visible to pretty much everybody out there. And I think that to your point about Pep Guardiola, is Pep Guardiola on the one hand, figures that are mostly apolitical. You have people that are political, but that belong basically to the camp that normally would be defending Israel at any cost. I mean, I'm thinking the US people like Candace Owen, people like
Hmm.
Tucker Carlson. I
Yeah.
mean, I know people in the European far right, in the German and Austrian far right, that
Hmm.
although they will not jump on the stage to say it, are absolutely disgusted, cannot quite figure out how to maneuver out of that. And
Yeah.
I think that what to me has become very interesting, as I was thinking about what you sent me the message saying, well, it is now something that not even the Israelis are trying to hide, and you still do not have any consequence or consistency between the fact of the matter staring at us in the face and the political position by, okay, fair enough, our governing class taking
Yeah.
the actions that are required of them, even by, international law, by treaties that they have signed on to.
Yeah, uh, I think that hits the nail on the head. I mean, I think you have a situation where there is no longer really any serious discussion about whether or not, for example, starvation is being used as a weapon, whether or not starving civilians, including children, are being intentionally targeted at points where they are trying to pick up, basic nutrition packages. I think there is no longer any real question about whether or not, civilian targets are being indiscriminately bombed. No one is denying this, right? And you don't. And I think that does separate this from other disputes or conflicts where you have really a kind of argument over the facts, dispute over the facts. And we've talked a lot in the past about this kind of, separate worlds, emerging, alternate facts and post-truth and this kind of situation. And we are in a strange situation now where these kind of facts don't seem to be debated. Nobody is bothering to say that's not happening, that's not true, it's more complicated, etc. And what you see, I think, I mean, I'm watching, for example, what unfolds in the European Parliament or what unfolds in the Belgian Parliament, is you have politicians, Paul Magnette, Mark Botenga, for example, who are just literally standing there screaming, reading out the facts, saying, do something, respond somehow, recall the ambassadors, just do something. And what you see, and I think I mean, it's interesting, or I don't know if it's interesting, but largely from the center right governing classes is just kind of, they're looking down, shuffling the papers. They're not denying anything. They're not saying this isn't happening. They're just sitting and shuffling the papers. I mean, you have, I think, really this kind of situation, which in my experience, at least in my life, I think is rather unprecedented in that regard, in that we all know what we are seeing. And the terms that were sort of disputed at one point in the conflict, like genocide, are now becoming increasingly accepted and used across the political spectrum. Right? That's what you said. Also, you see that amongst some MAGA supporters in the U.S. You see that amongst really mainstream academics within the North America and in Europe. You see that on the cover of Dutch newspapers. Academics agree this is a genocide, and you see just a complete inability or refusal to act in response to what is an absolute basic moral exigency, I think. And I think we are increasingly seeing this split that is coming up.
One of the things you said in one of the communications we had, you sent me a message saying that what was remarkable was that there was not even a discussion anymore. Nobody was trying to hide anything, that the facts were just now visible to everybody, even if they were evident for a very long time to anybody looking, because the Israelis had declared their intention of extermination and destruction. Probably even at infanticide, when they said that, nobody is innocent in Gaza, was clearly a message about the children, right? I mean, that they were not going to spare even the children, because those were the ones that you would normally think, okay, these are the innocents. That would not be.
I mean, and that's a long-standing position from the Israeli far right, by the way, right? That there are no innocents, that the children will grow up to be jihadists, right? I mean, that's a long-standing position there.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, it was either Ottobelli, who is now the ambassador to the UK, or somebody else in that circle, but a woman that I remember referring to the children of Gaza as snakes that need to have their heads cut before they grew into being, monsters or something of the kind. It's kind of, I mean, we can get to that, but I mean, it's every time, like, even though this is probably a large part of the way in which I approach the question of Gaza, every time I come back to these things, I just feel like I'm arrested. I just feel that I'm stopped in my tracks, trying to gather the fact that they're talking about children like mine. But the point you made is that the facts are now essentially accepted. Then there is I think the way I gathered what you were pointing to, but I will let you explain it yourself, is that there is almost a movement not just to normalization, but it's like acceptance of genocide and infanticide. This is what we're expected to do. It's like, yes, this is what we're doing, and we want you to like it.
I mean, I don't know if I would precisely use those words, but I certainly think that normalization is the right word to use. So I think what we are seeing, and that's what I said a moment ago, is exactly that, as you said, that the facts are really not disputed any longer, right? So the use of starvation as a weapon against the civilian population is not disputed. The fact that civilian, non-combatants, children, women, elderly are being shot with live ammunition at pickup points for emergency rations, where they are being essentially they have no, starve or go get these emergency rations and risk being shot at. This isn't disputed anymore, right? I don't know if it ever was disputed actually. The fact that civilian targets, cafes, bars, whatever, are being bombed, this isn't disputed. So I think these kind of
But
basic
so
facts.
just a second. I mean, I think that
Yeah,
there is a distinction to be made here, which is in fact quite interesting. On the one hand, there are residual voices from the Israelis and their usual like propaganda machine that goes out on screen. In fact, I saw Toveli a couple of days ago. Danny Dannon in the UN was like vomiting the same nonsense.
mm.
A couple of weeks ago, it's just like, we don't kill children. In fact, the exchange between Piers Morgan and Toveli was remarkable, because she said, we don't kill children. The guy that has been, that they make fun of him, calling him the moral quandary guy.
Yeah.
He said, like, this is complete nonsense. We're all seeing that you're killing people. So on the one hand, you have this sort of residual denial that I think that they very well understand that nobody believes. And then on the
Yeah.
other hand, you have the Piers Morgans, the Friedrich Merz in Germany, people like Keir Starmer in the UK, people like Macron, who know that, as a matter of fact, it's no longer in dispute whether the Israelis are doing this.
I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And I think what you see within the European Parliament, for example, what you see within national parliaments is this phenomenon where you have politicians. I mean, off the top of my head, I'm thinking of, because they're present on my social media feeds. Mark Botenga, a Belgian politician in the
Yeah.
European Parliament, Paul Magnette, Belgian socialist politician in the national parliament, literally standing there, reading the evidence out and screaming,
Do something.
do something, bon Dieu, faire quelque chose. And just you're watching what we called a moment ago, the governing classes, the center right, parties that are the leaders of the center right parties that are in governance, looking down, shuffling their papers, kind of with these,
Often playing with their cell phones.
yeah, playing with their phones with these sort of like smiles on their face, if we give them the benefit of the doubt, it's a sort of embarrassed, ashamed smile on their face. But I think increasingly you're really seeing the emergence of this kind of, there's not a dispute around the facts, there's acceptance. As you said, of course, even whether it's Tucker Carlson, Joe Rogan, Piers Morgan, they're coming out and saying, wait a minute, these facts are not in dispute. Children are being killed, starving people are being starved, et cetera, et cetera. And at the same time, nothing is happening. And we're seeing this kind of real divide. And I mentioned to you also, we're seeing that, culturally as well. So it's the festival season now in Europe, and you're seeing artist after artist come up on these stages. Again, just stating the facts, right? And, whatever, also chanting Free Palestine, or in the case of,
IDF, right?
death to the IDF in the case of Bob Dylan.
Which itself is actually, sorry, I'll interrupt you again, but
Yeah.
death through the IDF was remarkable, not just for the fact that it was said, but it was remarkable because of the massive echo, not just in Glastonbury, which
Yeah.
clearly you can see on screen, but if you actually open any feed for now, like 2 weeks, I think, I'd been seeing this thing sort of emerging as like a meme, emerging as like sort of wall tags. I mean, it's really just has become, the war cry, so to say, of a movement
And
of
and
people. I
that's
mean,
that
this is not political, right?
yeah, I mean, I think it's important also to say, that war cry emerged, right, out of, I can't remember the exact, phrasing, but there was the Northern Irish band, the Belfast band Kneecap, that
Nika.
was essentially censored, for chanting Free Palestine. And Bob Dylan came out and said, okay, they're going to censor Kneecap for that. Well, we're going to do this. Like, we're going to go one up. And the live feed continued. They didn't manage. They weren't. I don't know. The BBC wasn't prepared or whatever, so they didn't manage to cut the live feed. And this became, this death to the IDF became a kind of rallying cry. But I think it's super important to say that emerged out of an attempt to censor Kneecap.
So it's a bit of like, I mean, it's really a bit of, in a way, the pushback from the cultural apparatus, pushing
I think
back
that's right.
on the political and the power structure of also media. I mean, I worked for, sorry, that's my phone going down.
Yeah.
I worked for 10 years in television. I can tell you that as I saw this, I could imagine somebody going absolutely insane in the control room.
Yeah,
trying to find
cut
any
the live
button
feed,
that would
cut the
turn the
live
thing off.
feed. Yeah, someone trying to literally pull the plug out somewhere. I mean, I think you had, Massive Attack, so that's a little bit older. That's a band that I grew up with in the 90s and the 2000s. Also, really, I mean, not just putting up a Palestinian flag, but at their concert, putting on the screen, the amount of aid going from the U.S. and the U.K. to Israel, the amount of military aid. So I really think you are seeing this kind of emergence of these two worlds that are not also, they are meeting in the European Parliament, they are meeting in national parliaments, but they are not interacting, right? There is no.
But so can you actually, in a way, can you map for me what do you think these two words are? So one is clearly a managerial class that is basically managing power and managing sort of groups. But what do you think stands on the other side?
Well, I think a lot of things stand on the other side. So it's not monolithic, let's say, right? But I think increasingly it becomes a sort of, and that sounds a bit cliche or something, but this really guttural cry of pain and of just a demand for basic moral facts to be recognized.
I would say that death to the IDF, to me, the way that it sounded was quite literally the Botenga cry, for the love of God, I think was his exact words.
Yeah.
Or maybe that wasn't Botenga, but like one of them said, for the love of God, pas Dieu, for the love of God, do something. And I have to tell you that I receive numbers of messages daily saying exactly this. Do something. Anything.
It was really
something.
That was Paul Magnat in the Belgian Parliament. Bon Dieu, faire quelque chose, and then he gives a sort of litany of possible things. Recall the ambassador, break the blockade. I can't remember what the whole thing was, but I think it's
interesting because it points. Okay, so I think you're right that it points to a recognition, a demand for recognizing what is happening. But I also think I tend to read it in the way that you were pointing out earlier, which is that we all recognize this. You recognize this. I recognize this. Now, stop talking about it. Do something. And this kind of really pathological inaction in the face of the most incredible suffering that I think that we have ever. It's not the word probably most incredible suffering that has ever happened, but certainly it's the one that we have ever seen. Because
that it's being live fed to our phones on a daily basis. I think that's right. So you're absolutely right. It's there are other crises going on in the world, and of course, but the fact that this has been fed to us through our daily social media feeds for years now, on a day-to-day basis, and the fact of the active participation of our governments, right? Whether it's lending, moral support or sending weapons or allowing the transfer of weapons, the transfer of parts, whatever it is. This is something where I think there's a sense that we see what's happening, we know what's happening, no one is disputing what's happening, and not only are we not doing anything to stop it, but we're continuing to facilitate it. We, in the sense of certain let's say, nation states in North America or in Europe, right?
Yeah, but I mean, I do think that there is an extra component to that, which is that, okay, you might be able to escape Starbucks and stop drinking Coca-Cola and never eat like McDonald's again and so on and so forth. But it's very unlikely that you will be able to stop paying taxes. And what that means for a
or that
Palestinian
you're able to,
family.
Sorry, able to stop using Microsoft or Intel or whatever.
Right, exactly.
I agree with you on that point.
The taxation thing in places like Berlin and in places like Michigan quite literally means that you're putting money into helping murder your own family if you're a Palestinian, there. And I think that this is also what makes the demand. I think that there is a degree of cruelty, right, in the recruitment of family to put the financial means to actually murder their families. That makes this call of death to the IDF, or like, please, for the love of God, do something, whatever it is. It's really a desperate cry to precisely disassemble the system of silence and complicity and so on. That's how I read it, at least.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, I think that, there is a sense really of complete impotence in the face of this. And I think what we're talking about, these screams, these cries, are a kind of a way to try to respond to this sense of impotence. I mean, I don't want to say complete impotence, because I think that the work that people like Mark Botenga are doing to expose the degree to which European funds are not the funds of national states, but European funds are actually going to support Israeli weapons manufacturers. This is important work. So it's not that there's nothing happening. I think that's important.
No,
also,
I agree, but I think that it doesn't. So I can agree with most of that, and I think that even your assessment of like the European political class, okay, fine. I mean, there are people that are good and that are trying the best they can, but I'm just afraid that we are kind of at a. Sorry, I'm trying to stabilize my phone after telling you how to stabilize yours. I think that I think that the problem is that the task is not sinking McDonald's, and the task is not like, having an argument about the task is stopping the killing of children. And I think that the problem with that is that it requires an amount of immediacy in the action.
Yeah.
That every one of us that is sitting down looking at this understands very well that by the time any of these people, I'm always tempted to use much stronger language there, but any of these people, actually von der Leyen or Merz or Macron, actually do something, by the time they actually, like, the information in the neuron has moved to the muscle, there will be another couple of hundred children that will have been decapitated, incinerated, etc. So in a way, there is also a complete disconnect. I mean, 5 weeks ago or 6 weeks ago, Friedrich Merz here sat down in Republica on a stage and criticized Netanyahu and criticized Israelis and said that, he could not understand what the end of the operation in Gaza was and something like that. And then, of course, like the entire, because Germans work basically like gazelles, they went out saying, well, this has changed the position of the government. Absolutely nothing has happened. All we have heard, like, over the last 6 weeks, and he defended the statement, defended the policy in the last couple of days, saying, well, we had been very clear to our partners in Israel. And it's absolute bullshit. It's absolutely insubstantial, because what we're trying to, I think that there is a part of us here, which is, the Bob Dylan, the death to the IDF, people like Botenga, people like, and I want to get to this, like the kids that were sitting in encampments in Colombia, that understand that the schedule for action is right now. The window of opportunity to save another life is right now, this second. And you have a political machine that basically sits around going, well, thoughts and prayers and strong messages of rejection for the policy that one day might result in the change. And that kind of thing, I mean, the delving, this sort of waffling is essentially itself a way to aid the murder. Because the moment that you delay, the moment that you demur, the demurring itself permits essentially more killing.
I mean, I don't disagree with you at all, Martin. But at the same time, I think that this is we face a kind of, we talked about that a moment ago, a sort of moral catastrophe, and I think not just that, but we face a catastrophe of the rule-based global order, right? And within Europe, within the scope of European politics, if there is any desire to have some claim about the value of a rules-based global order, and that Europe has some role to play, right? And certainly some leadership role to play, that claim is in tatters, right? Completely and utterly destroyed. And I really do not think it can be put back together again.
Right. I'm completely in agreement.
So at the same time, I think that within Europe, and I think within North America as well, to the paradox, if you want to put it that way, that you just presented, I think we're faced with something that has so much immediacy, and yet we look at a political machine that just sort of works in platitudes and does nothing. That's certainly true. At the same time, I don't think there is another path forward other than political pressure, and I do think we see that political pressure, it's not fast enough. It will not prevent the death of probably hundreds or thousands of children in the next days, weeks, months, year, right? But I don't see at this point another avenue. And what I do see on the positive side is, like, look, you have 100,000 people marching in The Hague. You have, I guess, I don't know what it was in London, close to 1 million people or something like this. You have in Brussels 100,000 people. That's the largest demonstrations in Brussels in a generation. You have a population that is increasingly unwilling to accept the status quo that is being presented to them by their leaders.
I can
wait.
Yeah.
And we can accept that. And I think, also we can point to the U.S., right? And I wanted to talk to you about also the mayoral campaign of, I think the person is Zoran Mondani. I hope I pronounce it correctly. Which I also think represents a kind of watershed moment, because you are seeing something. He ran a campaign that really had nothing to do with Israel or nothing to do with Palestine. It was laser focused on cost of living issues, but he refused to back down from criticisms of Israel. Right? He refused to back down on criticisms of Israeli policy or of defense of Palestinian lives. And because of that, they're throwing everything they can at this guy. Right? I mean, we have a long road until November, till the general election, where normally you expect that the Democratic nominee will win, but they are throwing everything they can at this guy, including from within the Democratic Party, right?
Especially, of course.
Especially from within the Democratic Party, such that we can say, I think, without much hesitation, that, winning elections takes a back seat to defending Israeli foreign policy at the moment in the Democratic Party. Right. I mean,
because you can see that in a lot of discourse that is coming out of the Democratic Party, but you can go to the UK and see exactly that.
Absolutely. But I think the important thing is it's not working. It's not working. At least in New York City, it doesn't seem to be working. Right. Now, it's the same thing that you said before about, wait a minute. If you have across the spectrum, there are people who are saying, wait a minute, we agree on the facts right now, whether it's, sort of the MAGA media people, whether it's coming, people are saying we agree on these facts and something has to be done. So I think that there is movement, and I do want to try to. I mean, I'm not hopeful. I'm totally despondent and destroyed, but I do think there is some movement here, right?
I think, I can agree that there is movement, and I think that for as much as I care at all with public engagement, to me it's really not an issue at all. I think that the problem is that everything for me gets filtered through the question of saving lives. I mean, there is no other agenda. So I can be very sympathetic to, I think that people in dictatorships, and I think that a lot of people would say that in the US you have at least an incipient dictatorship, will fare much better than those of us in actual or at least apparent democracies. Because people in the US will be able to say, well, it wasn't us. This was the Trump machine, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. But people in democracies, these are our representatives. But I think that the point is that, you said, okay, there is no other mean. Well,
Well,
obviously, I
no, I
mean,
mean there are other means, right? So I'm not saying that voting or them or getting out on the streets and demonstrating are the only things that people can do. There are certainly practical things that people can do, right? And I hope that we are seeing a growth of those kinds of initiatives and endeavors. And I do think that is it's never enough. It's never enough, right?
I
It's
mean,
not fast
the
enough and
thing,
it's not
Darian, is
enough.
that what I want to see is a military escort going with a Madeline to the gates of Gaza and unloading 600 tons of baby formula. And I want
Yeah,
basically the
yeah,
Egyptians to go to the border and open fire on the Israelis to crack open the gates of Gaza and allow essentially medical equipment in. And I mean, and I think that this is so. I mean, I'm back to. I mean, we have very little time, but I do want to touch on the Colombia story. This to me was
yeah.
important. You being also in the middle of the academic fry, but I think that when I hear death to the IDF, when I hear for the love of God do something, when I see the Madeleine people getting on a boat and sailing, when I see people walking from Tunisia, what I see is something that has mainly to do with the single sense that there is no time. There is no
Yeah,
time. There is no
yeah,
time. You have no time. We have no
mm,
time. Those children have no time. There is nothing else to be discussed. There
yeah,
is no more time for political deliberation and debate. We don't have time for demonstrations. Don't bring your placards and flags out to the street. Just go to freaking Gaza, open fire on the Israelis, crack open the gates, and bring people food. Bring the baby's formula. Bring care for people. Sorry, for people who are ill. Sorry. And I think that this sense of everything has been tried. We have tried the deliberation road. We have tried the conversation. We have tried there's been demonstrations for I don't know how long, and nothing has had any effect. So I mean,
I understand. I understand what you're saying, and I think that I mean, you wanted to talk about the situation on university campuses, and I think that that sentiment is certainly felt, especially by students on university campuses, and this real sense of um, absolute desperation and immediacy, and again, this sort of moral cry that we need to do something in the here and now. And I don't disagree with you in terms of the actions that can be taken in the here and now. In terms of trying to support deliveries of aid, in terms of trying to get people out in all sorts of different. I mean, I think people. So you're right. I don't think that the standard avenues of political action and representative democracies are working right. I think that's crystal clear. That's also what we started with, right? That's just, the facts are clear and yet nothing is happening, and that's put us in this kind of state of shock almost, right? You wake up every day in this kind of state of shock that nothing is happening, and the response is, for the love of God, do something. At the same time, I think that, and that's has to do with the campus context or the university context a little bit. These are political questions. These will be dealt with. It's a moral exigency. It's a moral demand, but we also have to meet them politically. And
no. I mean, I
I
can
and I
agree with
think
that.
and I
Sure.
think I think what you see in campuses, what you see at universities in the United States, but also in Europe, is that governments are able to put enormous amounts of pressure on universities, right? So university, this whole idea of my tuition is funding Israeli munitions, that's not true actually, right? So yes, the universities are complicit in different ways, or some universities are, and they are collaborating with Israeli institutions, and this is actually extremely important for Israel, right? That universities are collaborating. This kind of tech transfer, knowledge transfer, is extremely, extremely important in many, many ways. But the pressure for this to keep happening, the pressure for this to keep going, is precisely coming from that governing class, which is doing nothing, right? And I think that's also where I think we talk about where does pressure need to be applied, and that's where pressure needs to continuously be applied. And that's exactly what we started by talking about the people who are working within national parliaments and within the European Parliament in order to apply that pressure. I think that has to happen, and at the same time as the kind of the real immediate concrete efforts to get aid in and to get people out, to get basic medicines, baby formula, etc., into Gaza, and to get people out. But those two things have to happen at the same time, right?
I just really wonder. I was talking yesterday to somebody who was trying to sort of work out with me the question of forgiveness, because I was saying, after the things that I have seen over 2 years, as a friend of mine says, I'm not God. It's for God to forgive. I'm not capable. And I really don't think I'm capable. I think that there is no way back for me. For me personally, I mean, there is no forgiveness for the Israelis. There is no forgiveness for the IDF. I don't know how I deal with meeting IDF people on the street. I mean, the benefit of the doubt has been lost. And then the question is, what is the political answer to this? And what I was thinking is that those are questions for my children to answer, for their children perhaps to answer. But if you ask me, how is it that I think of myself in this context, and it's hard often to talk about this because compared to what I'm seeing, I feel that it's ignoble to talk about, my own sense of sorrow. Yeah. But I do think that the way I look at myself is as the good German. As the good German that was standing there in 42 or 43, they were seeing their next door neighbors being taken away. They were, and there is a sense of profound guilt that I cannot get out of myself. I feel actual guilt that I can't shake. And at the same time, I feel a sense of profound disgust from which it grabs me by the neck. And I just cannot, because, in a way, what for me, and I told you this many, many times before, every time we talk, the feeling is that there is somebody out there demanding that I actually go along with the murder of children like mine. And
I think the very difficult thing is and I think we feel this every day, right? Is to go along with your day-to-day business, knowing full well, seeing full well every day, and not being able to hide from it. I mean, seeing it every day, confronting it every day, and still at the same time being asked to go about your day-to-day business. And I agree with you that these are many of these questions, the political questions and the moral questions, will be ones that our children have to answer. But at the same time, I think that we are faced with a moral and a political catastrophe that we have to confront. And I disagree with what you're saying, Martin. I think this your self-assessment, basically. I mean, you're out there every day, screaming at the top of your lungs, to put it. You're also screaming, bon Dieu, for the love of God. And I think at the same time, engaging in what concrete political activities, but also what concrete, let's say, moral activities are possible. And I think that in order for there to be change, this has to continue. This has to grow, and we can't.
Yeah, but I think that
we can't simply say that we've crossed the threshold beyond which there's nothing we can do anymore. Right? I think
I don't know if I would say that there is nothing we can do. I just don't know. I mean, I again, in my mind, it's still sort of the paradigm of what ought to happen is still the military escort for the Madeleine. That's the paradigm. Nobody opens fire, but if you have a military escort of European lines, it's much less likely that the Israelis will open fire, and then that will be delivered. That is what in my mind should happen. But I would say this. I would say that the problem with screaming at the top of my lungs, you sort of talking, friends of mine talk, is that it doesn't address. I mean, so there was a line that I loved from Eduardo Galeano, a Uruguayan writer, which is, it scratches, and it scratches very well. It just scratches in a place where it doesn't itch. And my problem is that I completely agree with you that we need to face a catastrophe, but these things are so completely secondary to me than children that are going to be killed in the next 5 hours. That to me is what I cannot forgive myself for. It's not that I don't try or I don't try to call or I don't try.
Yeah.
It's just that I feel that I failed for whatever reason. We failed, of course, but I failed at like stopping 5 more deaths, 10 more deaths. And God forbid that it will be at the end of the day the children of Hema, who I know in Sheikh Radwan, or the children of Amal, who I know in Khan Yunis, or it will be like Rafat, who is a doctor. God forbid. But even that proximity doesn't really, in a way, shift the fact that this failure feels like the everyday failure. Another day in which we could not save children that we knew were going to be essentially eaten alive by this early death machine.
I think we are living in this is what I've said it over and over again. We are living in the midst of a moral catastrophe. And we are watching it unfold day to day to day. And I think there is no getting around that fact. There's no avoiding confrontation with that fact. But I do think that the recognition of that fact is already something, and it gets broader and broader. And that's the only thing that I can I understand completely where you're coming from, in terms of the despair, and in terms of but I think this recognition of what is happening is growing. And I think that's something at this moment. It's not nothing. It's something. Okay. It's not enough. It's not fast enough. It's not enough, but it's something, right? And I think that is indeed what we have to go on at the moment. And I think this is what allows you to get up in the morning and continue, right? And continue to function and to live and to try to act within an ongoing moral catastrophe that you say we are kind of bystanders of, right? But yeah, that's.
Darian, thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to talk to you.
I try to turn off the microphone to do that, but I don't always succeed. We'll talk again. I mean, I'm sure on camera or off camera, we'll talk again soon. I send you a huge hug, man. Thank you for holding my hand a bit through this entire debacle.
I love because
it has broken the sense of isolation.
I think that's something. Yeah,
I do too.
Not nothing.
I do too. I send you a hug.
Take care, Martin.
You too.
Bye bye.